Cats were adored in ancient Egypt, yet they were mass bred and sacrificed under a guise of devotion. Hi, my name is Elizabeth, and I'm here to give you the perspective on the death of a domestic cat in ancient Egypt. So I will be categorizing the cats into 3 categories, which will be temple cats, house cats, and street cats. I do want to have a little disclosure really quickly before we begin, just to say that this video is a little dark. If you feel you're not as comfortable when we get to some of the darker parts, especially the colony cat section, then I understand if you don't want to watch and you want to click off, so please do, because researching for this particular video was actually kind of hard on me. It actually delayed me creating my YouTube channel because I had planned on making it all one video. The life and death of a cat was all supposed to be just like the life basically, but the death was a bit harrowing. And so I thought it's best to make it a separate video where we can celebrate life in one, and then we can discuss what happens when a cat dies in ancient Egypt, which isn't always the most humane. So first I want to start with temple cats. These are cats that were allowed to live out their lives in the temples. They had priests, caretakers, and embalmers hired in order to take care of them. So the temples were not only sites of worship and reverence, but also a place that were responsible for maintaining cat cemeteries. And they also oversaw mummification and burial. These cats were treated with great care and ceremony. They were embalmed with their organs removed, a resin applied, and wrapped in a decorated linen. And you had towns like Bubastis and Saqqara, which were the main sites of Bastet worship, where they mummified millions of cats and had huge cat necropolises. So within temple cats, there was 3 different categories of cats. You had your ceremonial, the living deity cats, that were allowed to roam the temple, and they were treated with the most reverence and had the most elaborate treatment. They were individually wrapped in a high-quality linen. They had painted or gilded masks, placed in decorated coffins with inscriptions. They also had a dedicated burial chamber near the temple's core. Wealthy worshippers also may have paid to have a statue of a particular temple cat commissioned. Then you had your colony breeder cats. So these breeder cats were still very sacred. So they still received high quality wrappings and sometimes had painted facial details. They could also have jewelry like amulets for protection in the afterlife. And they were buried in a separate organized section in the cat necropolis, away from mass offering pits. And that's where I get into colony mass offering cats, or should I say kittens. So while the breeder cats in the colonies typically live between 5 to 10 years, these mass offering cats, being mainly juveniles, only live between 3 months and 2 years old. These cats were wrapped more simply, they were mummified in bulk, and they were placed in large underground galleries without any individual markers. Now, these mass offering cats were in cat farms, and they were bred for this specific purpose. There was a major religious economy happening, and they had dedicated cat catacombs just stacked with mummies. These cats from these cat farms were ritually sacrificed. They were mummified as votive offerings to Bastet. So worshippers would actually buy these cat mummies as an offering. They were considered living embodiments of Bastet, and therefore they were very spiritually potent. And that meant that this was the greatest offering you could give her. These were seen as sacred messengers that could carry prayers, or you could request things like protection, fertility, or health. If you were wealthy, you could get inscribed tablets that identified the particular donor or even had a prayer for Bastet. Now, the process for mummification differs depending on the price and the time period in which this took place. But for the most part, all these cats were ritually and spiritually purified by the temple priests. and they might also be bathed. A cat bathed would have been more common among those that purchased a more elite cat. Then these cats were dried using natron, which is a salt mixture, and this process was to remove all moisture, and this varied depending on the size of the cat, so it would either be from a few days to a few weeks process. Then the cats were either left intact or desiccated. When it comes to how exactly a cat was prepared and what was removed, it really, once again, depended on the time and the cost. So at the peak, if you could afford a high status offering, you got a completely eviscerated cat mummy, which meant all the internal organs were removed. The body was dried and the cavity was packed. A quicker way of mummifying a cat, which was a much more simplified ritual, was keeping the cat intact. And this is when the entire body was preserved and no internal organs were removed. And the last type of mummy you might receive, which was much more common in the later, more commercialized period, was a fake or a symbolic mummy. And this was a mummy that may or may not have contained a piece of a cat in it. So you might get a cat bone and the rest of it is just filler. Or it might not have any piece of cat at all. These were mass-produced and considered low-income mummies and became very popular in later periods when they just ran out of cats in their colony centers because demand was so high. So if you just had a piece of cat in your mummy, to ancient Egyptians, having a piece of something sacred was just as good as having the whole. And when it came to having an entirely fake, only symbolic mummy, when you have a mummy that's gone through a spiritual ritual by this priest, it's as good as having the actual cat because it would have the spiritual energy that a priest would have given it. The purity of your intent were seen as the most important part. And archaeologists have actually found entire cat mummy factories that were operating underneath major temples. So for more elite mummies, you would also find some adornments on them, maybe painted eyes, collars, or gold leaf. So once mummification was complete, they would be placed in small shrines or boxes during blessings. Priests would then perform a consecration ritual to Bastet to invoke her blessing. And particular incantations can include requests for protection, fertility, health for a particular donor, and sometimes incense or food and drink could accompany the ritual. And then they were either placed in standing displays near altars or laying down in caches. So these particular caches were basically these huge storage units that contained thousands of cats, and they were all organized and carefully arranged. And once these cats were deposited there, these cats became a sacred property of the temple. So typically when a worshiper would purchase a cat, they would be purchasing it either directly for the temple or they would be presenting a cat for mummification. Now, once this was handed off to the temple, that is where it was done. From there on, the temple completely took care of the process because once a sacred animal was ritualistically blessed and purified, it was seen as a bad thing if someone improperly handled that animal, and therefore the common person wasn't allowed to handle the cat anymore. It was cared for by these temple workers and priests that knew exactly how to handle the cats. Now, another way of actually buying a cat at the temple for an offering would be to actually pick a cat out, but this was usually reserved for wealthy individuals because they had the means to do this. Once you went into the colony and picked the cat out that you liked and wanted for a ritual sacrifice, you would have to pay for the continued care of that animal. And then once they were ready to mummify this animal, then you were responsible for selecting everything in the process. You picked the type of adornments and mummification it had, any inscriptions, things of that nature. It was a completely elaborate and very detailed process. Much different than a common person who, if they didn't bring a cat, they would purchase a cat already pre-mummified and already had its ritualistic blessing, so it was a much quicker process. The thought of people going to a breeder and picking out the cat they want mummified, a living, breathing, healthy 3 month to 2-year-old cat, is horrible to me. Like, that's terrible. Like, you're marking this cat for death. But they saw it as a great honor. This was the cat they connected with. They didn't even see it as death, for instance. They saw it as more of, because they were associated with the divine, they saw it as more moving along to their next step. They saw them as being reassociated with the goddess, and it wasn't an ending of life. It was just the removal of a sacredness from the living plane to the next. Now I want to get more into this cat farm, and the whole conflict in this is one that seems very blasphemous, but also has a hand reaching toward devotion, right? This is it is complicated because widespread cat mummification really occurred during the 26th dynasty, and you had low quality cat mummies during its peak. And archaeologists have discovered millions of these cat mummies. And they obviously did not all die from natural causes. When demand outpaced reverence, you had mass cat breeding that led to cruel practices. And this is when you saw kittens killed in ways that are a bit hard to stomach. Within these cat farms, in these temples, you had priests and temple workers that deliberately killed these kittens by means of strangulation, broken necks, or suffocation in order to meet demand.
I wanted to go a little more specifically into how these kittens were killed, but I have a hard time talking about this topic, so I decided to do it off camera. That way it was just easier for me to gather my thoughts and record this. So I really want to hone it in how this was for these kittens. These kittens were weaned very early and often culled at just a few weeks old. Since small bodies were easier and cheaper to embalm and wrap, this made them more suitable for mummification. Sometimes they would even cull entire litters. Estimates suggest millions of cats and kittens were sacrificed over centuries. The first method they would use was neck breaking or cervical dislocation. A very common method. Many mummified cats, especially kittens, show signs of broken necks or dislocated cervical vertebrae. This was a quick way to kill small animals and left relatively little external damage, which was important for presentation in ritual wrappings. The next method was blunt force trauma. Some cats show skull fractures, which are consistent with a blow to the head from a club or a stick. This method was swift and efficient, but it has left clear fractures that modern imaging has revealed. The next method would be strangulation or suffocation. A lot of the wrappings and positionings of some mummies suggest strangulation with cords or suffocation. This technique did leave fewer skeletal signs, but some neck compressions and soft tissue evidence has been found. The last would be poisoning or drowning. This was less common and actually more speculative. Poisoning or drowning could have been used, though hard evidence is scarce because toxins actually leave little trace in ancient remains.
This was sanctioned because it was done religiously. And again, it wasn't really seen as killing. Although I have a hard time seeing that when you're obviously being the person doing it and you can see the suffering. I wouldn't think this would be something that Bastet would take kindly to. You're inflicting suffering and blasphemy, basically, that a normal person wouldn't be able to do without being executed. But because you're doing it for a religious reason, that is okay. And I have a hard time processing that because what made ancient Egypt's worship of cats so fascinating to me was because they were so protected, and it just feels like it was just this pretty picture painted for us that really just covered this mass animal cruelty. So it's kind of hard to associate the two together for me. I can understand it to an extent, their thought process, but as a person today, that is just animal cruelty. And these priests were expected to breed these kittens, kill them humanely or ritually, and then mummify and sell them as votive offerings. So it wasn't seen as cruelty, it was seen as a religious act to Bastet. And it was considered religiously necessary. It was economic. It had great value economically and religiously. And these priests were politically powerful. And so abusing cats for profit became accepted among the temple workers. Now, that doesn't mean the everyday person knew exactly how these cats were dying, but being as some of them were very small mummified offerings, you could probably stand to assume how these cats may have passed, and that the everyday person, while they didn't exactly see it happening or know exactly what was happening, could probably infer by the amount of mummies out there and the kinds of mummies they were receiving. So this really challenged my romantic image of cat worship in ancient Egypt. It was a big blow for me to learn about this. So I'm sorry if you didn't know about this and I've kind of burst your bubble there, but it's just hard because when you have such a romanticized image of something and you grow up with it, and then you learn, oh, hey, they sanctioned animal cruelty in mass, it's hard to learn about. But with the widespread of Christianity in later periods, animal cults were banned, and naturally these temples and cat farms were shut down. And I'm not saying this was a better thing for cats, because obviously you had cats that were in temples that were treated so wonderfully, and when these temples were shut down, obviously they turned more into house cats and street cats, and you kind of lost those divine sacred lines, which is quite a shame. But if that wasn't enough to have this whole thing happen in death, if the death itself wasn't hard to stomach, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Europeans came and they excavated and exported cat mummies to Europe in mass. This was a mix of Victorian greed, scientific curiosity, and a complete disregard for cultural and animal sanctity. Tragically, a lot of these, because they just had so many, were ground up as fertilizer. And this is not a myth or a speculated thing. They were legitimately ground up as fertilizer, which really sickens me. That you had the audacity to dig up these bodies, these obviously sacred mummified beings, and grind them up as fertilizer. But back then, the Victorians, while they were completely fascinated by Egypt, it was more like a treasure chest, and they really lacked the respect because they also did things to human mummies too, right? Like they ate them. It's just messed up. And you also had their mummified linen wrappings recycled and ground into paper pulp. So Egyptian mummies, human or animal, were literally pulped in the early days of mass printing. A 19th century reporter in Manchester actually described seeing a crate of mummified cats that were being smashed and shredded. And he was quoted saying they gave them no more reverence than old rags. You also had museums that would unwrap them and put them on display. They were desecrated for show and treated as curiosities rather than the sacred objects they were once considered. This was a time where archaeology was not regulated and there was little respect for things non-European. And cat mummies were cheap and abundant, and it made them really easy to exploit. Thankfully, some 19th century scholars and artists did speak out against the desecration of mummies, so I guess there was some humanity out there, right? And thankfully, some institutions did preserve them instead of destroying them. So now that we've talked a lot about temple cats, I actually want to get into house cats and exactly what that entailed when one of them passed away. When a household pet passed away, in particular a cat, because of its association to divinity, it was a spiritual experience and not a mourning. So when dealing with a mourning, it's usually when someone is in despair. And in ancient Egypt, when you had your beloved pet dog pass away, you would shave your whole body, and people would know that you were in this state. Now, when a cat passed away, they would shave their eyebrows, and this was original acknowledgement of a divine transition. The eyebrows marked the sacredness of the moment. And in Egyptian symbolism, the eye represented divine protection. So having your eyebrows shaved was a sign to everyone around you that you had lost that divine presence within your household. It was a loss of a withdrawal of the cat's protective gaze and Bastet's divinity. A house cat would usually be carefully wrapped in linen, and sometimes even placed in miniature coffins made from wood or stone. They could either be buried at home or mummified and placed in a family tomb or a special cat necropolis. Within these graves, archaeologists have actually found collars and toys, which actually suggested an emotional bond similar to ours today. So cats may have not just been seen as protectors of the people, but also members of the family. Now, when a street cat passed away, this was a public mourning, particularly if it was witnessed. If a cat died in a public place, people would stop to gather around the body. They were then carried to a temple or a shrine for disposal. While street cats were generally not embalmed, they were treated respectfully, and they were often placed in simple communal graves outside of town limits. But if you were brought to a temple, you would be deposited into a bulk burial pit, and sometimes you wouldn't even receive an individual wrapping of your own. Archaeologists have actually found in towns like Bubastis and Saqqara mass pits containing cats of varying ages and quality. And a lot of these look like they were probably street cats that either died of natural causes or were found dead. Now, if someone did end up killing a street cat either on purpose or accidentally, more likely than not, that cat would be taken to a temple for burial. This kind of harm to a cat was seen as an offense, and in order to appease the goddess, they would want to bury them in a way that was more respectful. What's actually interesting is that during the festival of Bastet, which we talked about a lot in the life of a cat in ancient Egypt, dead cats, even stray cats, would be offered to the temples as votive offering, particularly if they were in good condition. These cats would receive a simple mummification, a basic linen wrapping, and they would be buried in mass. In Upper Egypt, mummification was a lot rarer than Lower Egypt, since they really looked to the main gods or the sun gods in Upper Egypt, and cats weren't as common there as they were in fertile lands like along the Nile. Cats were buried more locally in a simple pit, sometimes near a shrine or temple, but usually always a quiet burial. Unfortunately, sometimes they were even left for scavengers, especially in poorer areas that just didn't have the means to attend to individual street cats. So, when it comes to the death of a domestic cat in ancient Egypt, I gotta say, it's eye-opening to learn a lot about this topic, because cats not only were treated very differently, but sometimes very inhumanely. Cats were adored in ancient Egypt, yet they were mass-bred and sacrificed under a guise of devotion. Priests were considered trusted to honor, and they were the people's moral and religious leaders. But they participated in practices that we would now call today systemic animal cruelty, all to feed a religious industry. To the ancient Egyptians, though, this was seen as moral because it was the greatest sacrifice and offering they could give to their goddess Bastet. I have a lot of mixed feelings when it comes to this topic because I do appreciate the reverence that they had for cats when it came to their lives, but it's really complicated when it comes to their deaths, reconciling that. Was it worth that worship when you had this mass scale of animal abuse that was sanctioned by the authority of the time? I don't know. So it's a very weighty topic, and obviously there was a lot of death, but it was also a culture that really contributed to the domestication of cats. For that, we have to thank their culture, but it doesn't mean we have to accept and appreciate every part of what they did to cats in ancient Egypt. Because when it came to offerings, it is my personal opinion that the pain inflicted on these kittens and cats was not worth someone being able to give an offering to the goddess. There's lots of ways they could have given offerings. I think it would have felt more respectful personally to the goddess if you had gifted them those that may have passed away naturally and not those in perfect health. But that was the way to gift something, right? It wouldn't even be a good offering in ancient Egypt if it wasn't in perfect health, if they had any illness or disease, or things of that nature, it was seen as a displeasure from the gods and therefore not as good as an offering that they could give them. They wanted to give them something in purity, in perfect health, something that mirrored what the goddess was giving them, something of value. And so that just was something that wouldn't have been offered. So what I learned from my research is I didn't realize that cats were offered as these offerings. I thought cat mummification was reserved for those that did pass away naturally, and I did not realize it was this whole mass industry. I would love to know your thoughts on this. It's definitely a weighty topic, and it's one the ancient Egyptians, morally for them, seemed absolutely fine. Because again, this was not death, it was a transition of divinity. So, curious about your thoughts. What do you think about this? Did you know about these mass offerings? Does it make you view ancient Egypt a little differently? Or do you still respect where they were coming from? Do you view them exactly the same? Thank you so much for watching my video. I really appreciate it, and I would love to see you in the next one. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you again.